Financialization describes a pattern of wealth accumulation in which profit-making occurs increasingly through financial channels rather than through productive activity. Essentially, this is what we've been calling MMM transactions. Oscar Jorda, Alan Taylor, and Marit Schulerek in Microfinancial History and the New Business Cycle Facts demonstrate the curious fact that only 15% of investment goes into capital creation. Thus, a vast majority of the money in the investment system is being used for the purchase of existing assets such as housing, stocks and bonds, commercial paper, and their various derivatives. Those MMM cycles we added to the monetary circuit could well account for 85% of all financial activity. In the spirit of the ancients, who cautioned that MMM behavior was fundamentally unbounded, I'm going to call this wild money. Greta Krippner describes in detail the emergence of this financialization trend. A plot from this paper shows the share of profits over time for three sectors: manufacturing, FIRE, which stands for financial, insurance, and real estate, and services. We see that the share of corporate profits in the U.S. economy take off for the FIRE sector, as we see a similar collapse in the manufacturing sector. Krippner demonstrates that this trend is not due to either offshoring or manufacturing or a shift towards services away from manufacturing. Notice that the profit share for the services is also falling. Rather, this trend represents a structural change in the U.S. economy, a consequence of what business is being done rather than where or how. Here's another Fred graph. This tool is so very useful, showing how financialization is increasing in time. The red line shows commercial banks' non-borrowed reserves, and the blue line all bank assets. It would appear that not only is the quantity of financial assets increasing since the 1970s, but that quantity is increasingly increasing. The jumps in the lines at 2020 identify a change in accounting rules for assets. But clearly something new is happening in the financial world, and this isn't what Perry Marilling would term Jimmy Stewart banking. General Electric is an exemplar of this trend. In the 1980s, CEO Jack Welch shifted the company focus from innovative manufacturing to short-term performance and financial engineering. Each year, he would fire 10% of the lowest performing managers who did not meet specified financial targets. GE Capital, the financial services division, finally closed down in 2021. Another example is that American, United, and Delta Airlines credit card-based frequent flyer programs were recently valued higher than their businesses of flying planes. Thus, businesses as well as banks are engaging with wild money. According to Thomas Piketty, in a grand opus of economic data analysis titled Capital in the 21st Century, which at 655 pages is not in your reading list, shows the signature effect of this wild money is ever-increasing wealth inequality. He explains this simply with the formula R is greater than G, which means that R, the interest rate of growth of money, is greater than the general rate of economic growth, or GDP. Economic growth is understood to confer benefits more or less equally across the income spectrum, while benefits from the growth of wealth adheres to those with the most wealth. Furthermore, Piketty demonstrates that R increases with wealth, which means you get higher rates of return the more money you invest. In Piketty's view, the Pax Americana of the mid-20th century was actually an historical anomaly caused by the economic shocks and abnormal economic growth rates from the two world wars. The claim that R is greater than G is in fact a natural quality of capitalist systems, so inequality is inevitable. Capitalism will always drift toward oligarchy without a significant counterbalancing force. This situation is exacerbated because not only is R greater than G, but R prime is greater than 0 and G prime is less than 0, which means R is increasing while G is decreasing, so R and G will continue to grow farther apart. So just how serious is this inequality in the U.S.? This video from Politizing, posted in 2012, has over 24 million views and describes the expected, ideal, and actual distributions of wealth in the U.S.
A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans, how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, In 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
A typical assumption made in economic studies of income distributions is that an economy can be thought of as divided into wage earners and then people who make their livings through ownership of assets, persons Ricardo termed rentiers. Berman and Milanovic find that now high wage earners are new investors, a situation they term homoplousia, referring to people who are wealthy in both wage income and capital accumulation. They show that the percentage of people in the top decile of capital income who are also in the top decile of labor income recipients has steadily increased in the United States from around 15% in 1980 to almost 30% in 2017. They further claim that this trend of rising homoplousia has far-reaching implications for social mobility. Having people who are wealthy both in terms of property and skills may enable them to create an upper class or an elite that has little in common with the rest of the population and that is able, through investment in their children, to transmit these advantages across generations. This, in turn, may lead, as explained, to even higher income inequality. This is precisely the dynamic described by Daniel Markovits in The Meritocracy Trap. Education correlates strongly with wage. Here is a demonstration of the increase in what's known as the college wage premium, the ratio of median hourly wage for those with a college education, not necessarily a degree, to the median hourly wage for those without, which is the blue line, plotted alongside the ratio of college-educated workers to non-college-educated workers, the red line. Note the wage premium is almost 2, meaning college-educated workers receive, on average, twice the wage of non-college-educated workers. Also note the lag and then the catch-up between the supply and the premium. This fact is presented as evidence that the creation of super-skilled workers induced skill-biased innovations that now make those workers so highly paid. Markovits further posits that not only do the elite transform jobs by employing technological innovations that require highly educated workers, but there also is a continual loop where wealthier people provide more intensive education for their offspring, who in turn further modify the jobs to require their skills. I'm a little skeptical of this technology focus and think it's an artifact of neoclassical growth theory, but we'll come back to this question in a later segment when we talk about the relationship between existing social institutions and development trajectories. All these descriptions give us indications of the extent of inequality, when it emerged, some possible effects, and how it may be perpetuated, but nothing about how wild money affects fundamental economic dynamics around production and consumption. What is the systemic effect of a runaway feedback cycle where money is breeding instead of flowing? The neoclassical theoretical apparatus, so to speak, was not designed to accommodate heterogeneity or differential effects. Thus, modern economic studies of inequality are predominantly econometric in nature, such as all those we've seen in this segment. The practice of econometrics involves studying empirical data and fitting frequentist statistical models to determine correlations and then to speculate on causations. This area of research will greatly benefit from complexity methods such as agent-based modeling, which allows the generation of differential effects based on theoretical dynamics and providing a possibility for testing that theory. Ricardo, who brought us the term rents, considered rentiers to be parasites on the production system. Keynes, likewise in the general theory of employment, interest and money, writes, "I see, therefore, the rentier aspect of capitalism as a transitional phase which will disappear when it has done its work, and with the disappearance of its rentier aspect, much else in it besides will suffer a sea change. It will be, moreover, a great advantage of the order of events which I am advocating, that the euthanasia of the rentier, of the functionless investor, will not be sudden and will need no revolution." I'm looking forward to what future complexity studies of inequality can tell us about the behavior and consequences of wild money.